Well, I just I take care of my own feet.
Time for the Angler Within podcast with Roy Bilby.
How are we doing today, JD?
I am doing so much better now, Roy. Do you know what I did today?
Enlighten me.
Well, let me back up and tell you the situation. Because I can't reach my toenails because of my knee on my left leg,
Okay.
I haven't been able to clip them. And the MRI came back and I don't have to get surgery, it would appear, which is great news.
That's very good news.
But I'm going to the doctor's, but also I have to go to an event tomorrow where I have to wear a suit. And I haven't been wearing socks since the 13th of April when this happened. So my feet were a little rough for wear. I mean, I've cleaned the one it's okay. Like the okay leg I've kept clean, right? But I really can't bend over the right way to get to my toes.
I can't imagine that you could.
Yeah. When I went to the doctor before, I had let my toenails get a little long because it was winter and I wasn't snowboarding, so I was just being lazy. I didn't clip my toenails, and
he mentioned it.
No, I mentioned it. I was self-conscious about it the whole time that I was in there with him. I felt terrible, and they're like, "Oh, these are nothing. You should see all the sloth toes that we deal with."
I can't imagine.
Which is when the like the nail curls around the front of the toe.
Yeah.
Which is like I've never come close to, but
I can't imagine.
And so
they see it all.
Yeah. So I wasn't anywhere near bad, but for me, it was bad for me. Like I wouldn't want a lady friend seeing my toes like that for sure.
Okay.
Anyway, today I went and got a pedicure.
Oh,
yeah. I had a nice Vietnamese
kidding.
lady wash and clip my feet.
That's interesting.
You ever had a pedicure?
My wife does them, so yes. She's like, "Let me do one on you." I'm like, as long as I can read Bassmaster while you're doing it, fine.
So Roy has perfectly pedicured feet.
No, I did it once. She wanted to. I mean, she learned how to do that in cosmetology.
Oh, you did it one time?
Yeah, I did it one time.
One and done.
That's just not the thing for me.
You wouldn't go again.
Well, I take care of my own feet, I got to keep them on the trolling motor pedal. Enough said.
Are you a flip-flop guy? You like wearing flip-flops in the summertime?
No. Nope. And I was known for years on an old tournament circuit by the president of the club as Chief White Shoes, because I would buy a brand new pair of white sneakers for every tournament season.
Are you serious?
I'm serious.
That was like your flair.
That was like my thing.
That was your signature.
Always white sneakers, but I mean, we did a walleye tournament early in the season before we started the bass season, just so everybody could run their boats and we could compete. And I had Lunker for the tournament, and they took pictures of first, second, and third place and Lunker. So we're all standing there, and he takes a photo, and everybody's got these grungy shoes, and I got these bright white sneakers. And he's like, "What did you got? Brand new shoes?" I said, "I buy new sneakers every tournament season. Just so I'll let you in on a little secret." And my tournament partner of 14 years, Ryan Coulter, said, "I get why you do that. I'm not a flip-flop guy. If I do that, I got to put sunscreen on my feet because I am very prone to developing skin cancer from sun exposure because
construction.
I did heavy construction for 20 years, and now I just deal with the aftermath. Now I cover myself up. So if I was to wear sandals, on the boat, which most guys do when it rains, if it's going to rain, I'll do that. I rode with Brent Chapman. A lot of guys know his name, professional angler. He's on the Major League Fishing circuit now. He's done very well for himself. I rode with him in a Pro-Am tournament years ago, 1997, Lake Champlain. He was my first day pro partner, and he's wearing sandals like I saw everybody do. It rained that first day. I got rain gear on. I got my brand new sneakers, And I'm like, why are you wearing sandals? Your feet are going to get wet when it rains. And he looks at me, he goes, so are yours, but mine will dry out. And I went, aha. So that's why they all wear sandals. And I've never been that guy, but if it's going to rain and we've got a tournament, we don't have rain delays, we don't have rain days, we fish. So I'll wear sandals on those days because it's going to be overcast. But the rest of the time, I cover up. And for every tournament, I do this. I break out a brand new pair of socks because there is nothing more comfortable than the cushion in a brand new pair of unworn socks. So, brand new socks, new white sneakers every tournament day. My feet have never been more comfortable, and that's one less thing on my mind. It helps clear my head and helps me focus when I'm not thinking about my feet. So, I think we've talked enough about feet. This is this is a fishing podcast for crying out loud. So, the topic of today, a timely topic as we're in the very beginnings of the month of May, is it's crappie time, everybody. And I love to crappie fish as much as I talk about my perch and I chase bluegill, specifically target them, which is coming up on the 12th with the first full moon. And that's another subject. But I have always considered crappie to be the king of the panfish. They're just such a cool, special fish. They can take a large bait. They've got a compared to the rest of their body, they're like a largemouth bass. They have a very large mouth compared to the rest of their body. And they can take a good sized bait. But as I mentioned on our last podcast, because of where their eyes are positioned and because of the angle of their mouth, they feed up. They rise up and they take stuff out of the water column. So when I'm fishing for crappie, it's paramount. I will either use monofilament or braid, never fluorocarbon on my ultralights, because both monofilament and braid float and will help slow down the sink rate of your bait and help suspend it. And I almost always use a 1/16 ounce jig so that my bait falls super slow. And that includes with that 2-inch squirm and shad. If you really want to suspend a bait, use the Z-Man plastics, which have the proprietary Elastec formula, which is very buoyant and floats. And the weight of that jig will pull it down, but it will sink super, super slow, which is just killer for crappie. Now, another technique I use, and you've heard me talk about this, is the slip float. I never use the old fashioned float. I grew up with it as a kid, the old red and white with a little button on top that had the clip in it and the clip on the bottom, and you clip it to your line. But that pinches and weakens the line. I have used nothing but slip floats for at least the last 35 years. And if you're not familiar with a slip float, it is the coolest deal in the world. I use Thill floats made by Mick Thill. They are the absolute best. And floats are not expensive, folks. Everybody can afford to buy the absolute best. They're about $1 a piece, but they are supremely made. I've never had one fail. They are hollow through the center with a tube going through them, and you feed your line through that. But before you do that, you attach a bobber stop to your line. And you can get these from Bass Pro Shops, Cabela's. You can get these from a lot of supply houses, Tackle Warehouse. Everybody's got these, and they come on a little plastic ring, and you'll have 5 or 6 very thin wires off with a loop on the end, and you'll have a little bead and it looks like a little tiny rubber egg, and that's your bobber stop. You feed your line through that loop and then just slide the bead and rubber down off the loop onto your line until your line comes out the other end. Your line is doubled over when you pass it through the loop. You double your line over, just a short length of it, and then you slide both the bead and the rubber stopper off the loop of wire, which collapses flat and slides onto your line until the free end comes out. And that rubber it'll pinch your line, but it's soft rubber, so it doesn't damage it at all. And there's a bead there, usually typically a little red bead. Now you slide them up your line about 4 feet. So you got a lot of slack to work with. And then you put your slip float, you thread the line through the top of the float till it comes out the bottom. I tie on a 16th ounce jig and a little whatever plastic I'm going to use. Sometimes I'll use a squirm and shad. A lot of times I'll use what's called a baby shad, which is like, it looks like a mousy, but it's an inch and a half long. It's a soft body piece of plastic with a fairly long tapering tail. And then I have smaller versions of that that are only an inch long with a shorter tail. And I actually use one of the most popular trailers for a rubber skirted bass jig or to rig with a fixed peg sinker to as a punch bait is these beaver style plastics like the Woolly Bugger by Yum and some of these others from all the different companies, just these beaver style creature baits they're called. But Bass Pro Shops has one called the Little Beeve, and it's an inch long. And these look more like the Daphnia or what's called freshwater shrimp that all these panfish feed on. It's such a realistic imitation. I rig those on a 16th ounce jig and I tie my knot super tight to the eye of the jig, just a little bit behind center so that sits horizontally in the water underneath my slip float. Now, here's the beauty of the slip float. By sliding that bobber stop up and down your line, you can adjust the depth that you're fishing at. If you've got crappie on your brand new Lowrance Hook 7 unit on your new honking kayak you got that's super wide, you can see crappie suspended a foot off the bottom in 12 foot of water.
Really?
You can't cast another type of float to those fish. If you have 11 foot of line hanging below a float, you need a 12-foot rod to cast that. And it's going to cartwheel itself and tangle in the air on its way out there.
But on a slide bobber, it's not going to do that, though.
No, you just slide that bobber stop. They're tiny. They go right through the rod guides, right onto the reel. You can set that at 11 foot and reel that float and jig combo, 4 inches down from your rod tip and fire it wherever you want. And the weight of that jig will slide that line through that float, which is laying horizontally on the surface, until it hits that bobber stop. And that bead just below that bobber stop is too big to fit through that hole in the slip float. And when it gets to that bobber stop and bead, the weight of that jig is going to make that float stand up. And now it's vertical on top of the water surface with the weight of that jig. It takes the slightest tug to pull that under.
So is the bobber stop below or above the bobber?
It's above it.
Above it, right. And
It's
so it
above
pulls it all the way down and it yanks it to that point. Now, the pressure from the top of the bobber pulls it straight.
The pressure from the jig with that,
pulls it, but
the weight of the jig with that bead on the top of the float will actually lift it and raise it so that float is vertically standing up with the bead on top of it.
Interesting how that works, as you would assume it would be the bottom.
It is, and it takes a while for a 16th ounce jig to get down there. I was catching crappie last year on a flat that was 22 foot deep, and there was all kinds of tree limbs on the bottom. That's what was holding them there. I actually put an AquaView camera down and I could see crappie, I could see largemouth, I could see perch, I could see bluegill, but I was catching a lot of crappie down there and occasionally these other fish, but I was targeting and catching a lot of the crappie that were down in those branches, but they were in 22 foot of water. I experimented with a 16th and an 1/8 ounce jig because it took a while. So it took like 17 seconds for that 16th ounce jig to get down to where the fish were, to my line bellied out. But with an 1/8 ounce jig, it only took about 8 seconds. So the fall rate was, twice as fast. But I got more strikes on that 16th ounce because it fell slower and gave them more time to rise up and take it.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I could have done that with a slip float. And I like to use a slip float when there's a light chop on the water, not a tremendous chop, just a light chop, enough to make that float bounce up and down just a little bit, because that's going to work. My jig is going to be just kind of dancing just a little bit in the water, but it's going to be doing it in place. And you just can't imagine how many crappie just gravitate up to that and suck it in, and that float goes down. Because with these still floats, they're slender and it takes very little pressure to pull them under. These fish feel hardly any resistance, and they bury those floats. And that goes back to the kid in me. I was taught to fish with a cane pole and a bobber, and I still love to see that float just vanish. And I get a kick out of it. And I mostly do that when I'm crappie and bluegill fishing. I don't do it a lot for perch. I prefer to work the lures and entice the bites, which I also do with crappie and bluegill. But if I'm fishing alone, I will take 2 anchors. I typically use a Cheney style anchor, which has got 2 points on it that pivot, and it's got a long neck on it with a ring on the end, and that's what your anchor line is attached to. And if I'm in my small boats, that's what I'm using. And I typically take the small boats out to these lakes to fish for crappie, because people follow bass boats, but they don't follow john boats. They typically see a john boat and they could care. That guy's just fishing for bluegill. He don't know what he's doing. I really think that's what people think. They don't bother a guy with a john boat. But if you're out in your nitro with your mercury on the back, you get followed. You do. It happens. And the way to avoid a crowd is just to go kind of under the radar. And that's why I crappie fish out of my john boat most of the time. I do like using my big tracker, my Pro Team 175, to crappie fish occasionally, because I just like walking back to the live well and dropping them in. But bluegill fishing is strictly out of the john boat. If I'm fishing alone, I'm going to use those Bass Pro Shops ultralight combos to cast for these bluegill and crappie. So I'm feeling the strike, and I'm putting my finger on the pulse of what's going on with the activity of these fish. But if I'm alone, I will also put a slip float out there. And what I do for that is I take the wind direction into consideration. I will not use a slip float until I got a light chop on the surface, because that's going to help work that bait for me. And I know what the depth is I'm throwing to. I'll suspend it roughly 12 inches off the bottom, between 12 and 18, but typically 12, most the lion's share of the time. And what I'll do is I'll use that Cheney anchor. I'll take the wind direction into account. My second anchor, my first one will be off the bow, and I'll give that a lot of line. So I've got a very shallow angle on it, so it digs in that bottom real good. And when I come to the end of that rope, the boat's going to start to swing around. My second anchor off the back of the boat is right off the transom, is going to be a heavy anchor. It's usually a 15-pound anchor, rubber coated. And once the boat gets parallel to the wind, I drop that thing, let it plummet right to the bottom, and I tie it off with no slack. Now my boat is locked in position, broadside to the wind, and I can sit crossways on that center seat with the wind at my back, and I can put that slip float out where I want it, and it's going to stay in place. It's not going to swing back and forth across my casting lanes. So I can cast wherever I want, and I can keep that slip float in place. If you really don't pay attention to the wind direction and you just use one anchor, your boat's going to swing all over the place, and that float's going to be on your left, and it's going to be all the way to your right. You're going to have slack in that line. If you position the boat the way I just suggested, you will always have a fairly tight line to that float, and it'll be a straight line, because the float will stay where you put it, because the wind's at your back, and that will keep your line to it reasonably tight. And that's the best way to do it. And then you cast everywhere but there. I usually keep it off to the side, but it stays straight out from where I casted. And then I've got that bait working, and then I can work something totally different everywhere around it for either crappie or bluegill, depending on what I'm targeting. And I'm headed out tomorrow after I turkey hunt for another crappie trip, back to where I got 14 of them last week. And I think the bite should be even better now. And I'll probably go the next day too, because I have a client lined up, a friend of mine. But anytime I take somebody out, I refer to them as clients, humorously.
So I talked to the mad scientist today.
You did?
Yeah, he reached out
So did I.
after he listened to the episode. He sent me a picture of me wrapped, not me, but a person wrapped in bubble wrap to put them onto the boat.
No kidding.
Yeah, of course. So I called him.
We got to get him on this podcast.
Yeah, we will. We will.
He was when we did our Anglerversary, he was very comfortable on the mic.
So that's
he can offer colorful commentary.
I know he can. It's fine, especially when the two of us gang up on you. It'll be perfect.
I love him. He's awesome.
Can you imagine having all four of us on here? You, me, Mark, and Nick at the same time, all talking. It would be
good grief.
You guys it'll be so much fish brain happening at one time.
Stay tuned for part 2, right? That'll be a marathon episode.
He said that you turned down a trip out to Lake Erie at the end of the month.
I did, and I wanted to do that in the beginning to recap the perch season, and I do want to talk about this. I told you in the one podcast that I said it's been a tough perch season, and I am going to go tomorrow, and win, lose, or draw, I will give you a report, because as a coworker loved to say, the truth is seldom pretty, and I will give you the truth on the day of fishing I have, good, bad, ugly, or indifferent. And I ended up having the best day of perch fishing I had all season, and I knew it was going to be my last day because turkey season was starting, and I got to be crappie fishing. So I knew it was going to be my last day. And yeah, it was the best numbers day of the entire, what I call my perch season, which is generally end of March, beginning of April. Some years, typically it's about a 2 to 3 week season. On the good years, it lasts the whole 3 weeks. And that's when they're coming into spawn, and you can just catch them with reckless abandon. And I can get as many as I want in the freezer while still releasing a truckload of them. Last year, I tallied it up in my journal, 458 perch in my boat across 3 weeks. 458. That's how good it can be when it's good. I have never seen a perch season like I experienced this year, with that roller coaster spring that we had, where the ice went out in a week. 12 inches went out in a week. And then it was nice for like 3 days. And then it snowed and it froze again. Twice it refroze. There were days I was driving to the lake knowing it was open, and the ponds I passed on the way that were open the day before had ice bank to bank. That's the spring that we had. I mean, waking up in the morning and it's 16 degrees and you're waiting for it to get to 30 so you can leave in your line. You can cast it without it freezing solid on your reel. That's the spring that we had. And it was just a roller coaster of water temperature, trying to get up and then falling back, and then trying to get up and falling back. Because of that perch bite, that window, prior to they spawn, lasted 5 weeks. But during that 5 weeks, I never had any really good numbers days. Some days we got, 35. Some days we got 5. There were days where there were 2 days where I had 7 or 8 in my basket to bring home, and I dumped them at the end of the day saying, I'm not going to bother with that few of fish. The next time I go, I'll bring home 15 or I'll bring home 20, and I'll have plenty to fillet. And because of that, there were only X amount of days that I did bring fish home. But because it lasted 5 weeks, I do have enough perch fillets in my freezer that we can have perch every Monday night until the end of August right now. But we're not going to do that because I'm going to also get a bunch of crappie in there, a bunch of bluegill, a bunch of walleye, because we rotate a different species every Monday night. And we had walleye last night, and I had 2 packages of perch for my relatives that were out from California. They wanted a fish fry. So, I mean, I burn up a couple packages doing that, and I still have a freezer full. And mind you, most of the perch I catch, I release. And so I put plenty back, but I still had plenty to fillet, and it's going to be good. So having the advantage of fishing for 5 weeks for these fish because the bite was so sporadic and generally weak. Like I said, the last day was the best day. We boated 47 perch and I kept 20, but 47 was the best day of the entire 5 weeks. In a normal year, 47 is average. I had a season 2 years ago where no, it was last year when we had the 458. We averaged 50 per. I think there was only 1 or 2 days when we caught less than 50, and we broke 114 on one day. And there was another day we had 70, another day we had 80. That's a normal season when you can catch them in that kind of numbers. When they're in, you can seemingly cast to the spot and it's like every single cast. Until they stop, and then it'll be quiet for a little bit and then they'll fire up again. But we never had that day this year until the last day that I knew I was going to fish for perch. And I had enough in the freezer. I felt, as long as I caught a bunch of crappie and bluegill and walleye, to last until I start fishing for perch again in November and December. So I just don't fish for them in the summer because I'm chasing other fish and it's tournament time. So I do my crappie and bluegill fishing now before the tournaments start. And then during the week, if I have good conditions and I'm getting low on one or the other, I'll go out and get some more. This perch season, I'd like to hear from listeners because this was the year that was so different. And I have talked to other anglers and I've been having other guys I fish with message me saying, I don't know, maybe it's me, but I'm just not catching the perch this year like I usually do. And I said, no, that's going on everywhere for everybody. And that's why I'm hearing from everywhere. And it's because of the weather that we had this spring, that up and down water temperature that just it should stabilize and then gradually rise. And that brings them in droves. And it just didn't happen that way this year. I talked to a guy this morning, a guy that I've goose hunted with and I've ice fished with that contacted me about fishing for perch several years ago. The guy that I went out to Owasco Lake with. We've been in touch the last several weeks, and he said, I'm just not finding them on Owasco. I've been going to the places I typically catch them, but I'm not seeing any grass. And I said, well, that's the problem. You've got to find flats that have grass or they have nowhere to attach their eggs. And he's been seeing some perch. He had an experience the other day when they would make a cast, they could see perch everywhere, but the perch ignored them. They were seeing hundreds of small perch, but they ignored their offerings. And I've run into that before. I told him on Canandaigua Lake, which is very, very clear water, where we could see like 50 perch, big ones, follow every cast right back to the boat with their nose about an inch away from the bait. And that happens sometimes early in the year during the spawning season when they're preoccupied with spawning. And I know other people have seen this. What I do in that situation, because it can be very frustrating. You're switching baits like crazy, yet they follow every bait right back to the boat with their nose an inch away from it with 49 other big perch right with them, and then they disperse. And the next cast, the same thing. It's like Groundhog Day over and over and over. So what I've done in that situation is I've left the area and just let it rest for like 40 minutes, 45 minutes, and then I'll go back and approach it from a distance, and I'll make the longest cast I possibly can to reach the area where those fish were, and I'll generally catch 2 or 3 right off the bat on my first few casts, yet that hooked fish is coming in with 50 other fish with it. And after 2 or 3 of those fish, they stop biting. I really don't know why they do that unless they're so preoccupied with spawning, but then why would they follow the bait in? Why would they do that? It just doesn't make sense. But he has been experiencing that. But then he talked to a guy who lives on the lake and fishes it every day. And he said he's catching very large female perch still right full of eggs in 35 to 38 foot of water. And I told him that's because the water at that depth is not up to the temperature yet where they need to spawn. And again, we're going by surface temperature here. So when the surface temperature is like 42 to 48, That's the range, and it can extend up to 50 in some circumstances, according to DEC. I've not experienced that. I have not experienced that. They say it can happen, and so when you got the surface temperature in that 45-degree range, eventually those fish in that deeper water are going to get wind of that, and they're going to migrate up, and they're going to start biting. So the perch fishing on Owasco is not over. He's going out next week. And I said, tap into some of those deep fish or see if they've migrated shallow, but find the grass and you'll find the fish. And so that's the recap on the perch season. The last day was the best day. We finally got a decent number, but it was the highest number all year. And in every other year for the past 15 years, that's been the average day is 47, 50 perch. Anything less than that was a slow day. And I blame it on the weather that we had this spring, where the spring just couldn't arrive. But that helped it to last 5 weeks, which helped me to get enough in the freezer while still releasing probably 80% of the perch I caught. And I intend to do the same thing with the crappie and the bluegill. So if you guys like to crappie fish, try what I've mentioned. And again, my number one go-to for crappie, like perch, is that Bass Pro Shops 2-inch squirm and shad, but generally on a 16th ounce jig head, so it has a slower fall rate. And you can still feel everything that's going on. And those crappie, you can tell when a crappie is hooked because they have a different head shake to them than the perch do. And of course, the bluegill make those tight circles. You feel it feels like you're reeling in a chatterbait. That's a bluegill. You can generally tell what kind of fish you got by the way they're playing out as you're reeling them in. And the next time we're on the microphones here, I will give you a report on how my crappie fishing went. But that's my go-to for crappie. Just like with perch, for bluegill, I lean more towards the 1-inch tubes and the 1-inch baby shad baits, which I just call them a guppy, but they are killer for bluegill because they can get them in that little mouth. And if you're going to bluegill fish, do not miss the full moon this month of May. The full moon is on the 12th, and 2-3 days prior, the day of, and 2-3 days after, that's when the bluegills are going to make that first spawning move into the shallows. And it's easy to tell where they've been because it looks like the surface of the moon with all those circular marks honeycombed along the shoreline. Next month, they'll do the same thing on the full moon, but there's going to be a lot of grass to contend with. Right now, you can get to them without hanging up at all. And the May full moon for bluegill is the best. We went out last year on the full moon, my doctor and I, and we whacked 95 bluegill. We didn't keep that many. Good grief, I do not want to keep that many bluegill. So if you haven't crappie fished, or if you want to get out there because you have crappie fish and just haven't had enough, like me, try the tips I put out today and see if they make a difference in your crappie fishing. And, contact us. Direct message me on my Instagram. Let me know if these things are working for you, because we want that kind of feedback. The whole point of this Angler Within podcast is to put information out there to help everybody catch more fish. That's the whole point.
So yeah, slide into Roy's DMs at all lowercase Roy Bilby. Seriously, if you have a good enough question, we'll discuss it right here on the show. We'll do it. You'll be famous.
We'll put you on the Angler Within podcast.
If we get to a point where we become big for our britches, we'll get merch, and then we'll send you guys merch if we air your question. Oh, there's your phone going off just in time.
We'd love to hear your questions. I'd love to answer them on the air and help you tap into your Angler Within.